Hi and welcome to a video about what is probably the pride of my graphics card collection, the Elusive PCI version of the Voodoo 4 4500. I've had this card for a long time. I got it in a big bag of loot for not much money. I made a video about that a long time ago. I'll see if I can dig it out and put a link below if anybody's interested. But yeah, I've not really taken a closer look at this card, and that's what we're going to do right now. Not only are we going to take a look at the card, we're also going to run it up against some of the competition. So I figured that for bargain bucket kind of graphics cards, in 2000 the GeForce 2 MX is probably the closest thing that people would be thinking about buying if they weren't buying the Voodoo 4. So yeah, we're running it up against the original GeForce 2 MX, not an MX 400, so it's the original clocked version. And also various people in various places on the net claim that the Voodoo 3 is actually faster than the Voodoo 4, so we'll be running it up against the Voodoo 3 3000 as well. And this is what the box would have looked like if you were lucky enough to have one. And indeed, this is the PCI version. And yeah, so I've got the card, but not the box. Would have been nice to have, but yeah, that's what it looks like. Still looks like one of those cool boxes with the face on. Voodoo 4 was the second chip to come out with the fabulous new VSA 100 chip back in 2000. And the Voodoo 5 was the first. The Voodoo 5 5500 with the two VSA 100s and the Voodoo 4 with the single one. It did boast that it covers all the bases. You've got Direct 3D, you've got OpenGL, and you've got Glide all on a single card, which is rather cool. The cards using the VSA 100 were pretty cool in some ways. They were some of the first cards to introduce full screen anti-aliasing. They made use of T-buffers, which allowed the frame buffers to be more efficiently used when rendering. So that was the good stuff. The bad stuff was that 3DFX were being left behind by the competition in a few major ways. On these cards using the VSA 100 chip, the process for fabrication was still the same as the Voodoo 3 at 250 nanometers, whereas the competition, like the GeForce 2 MX, had stepped down to 180, meaning they had smaller and cooler running chips than 3DFX. So 3DFX used the excuse to say that they stuck with 250 nanometer because it gave them higher yields, but it probably just was, they were just a bit behind the curve. And 3DFX still didn't bother fully implementing AGP by this point, so there was still no hardware textures being used, and they were still stuck on DirectX 6 when everybody else moved up to DirectX 7, so they were pretty crap in some ways. At long last on these cards, one good thing is that they fully implemented 32-bit color, which first for 3DFX, so the Voodoo 5 had it first, and the Voodoo 4. Bizarrely, it meant you could now play OpenGL games and Direct 3D games in glorious 32-bit color, but they hadn't updated their own API, so Glide remained at 16-bit, which is a bit weird. They were really like all over the place at the end, which is a bit sad. It's kind of sad, but right up until the end, 3DFX were advertising their final last ever line of cards after all of the glories of previous years. Three models: the Voodoo 4 4500 we're looking at now, the Voodoo 5 5500, which was the other card that kind of hit the mainstream along with the Voodoo 4, which was a 2 VSA 100 processor card with 64 megs of RAM, I think, and in between a very rare, not formally released Voodoo 5 5000, which only had 32 megs of RAM but still had the two processors the same as the 5500. From what I've read, there are a few sort of rare examples of not for resale engineering samples or whatever kicking around of these cards, but by and large it was only the 4500 and the 5500 that actually made it into the market in any meaningful way. Yeah, it really tugs at your heartstrings when you see how 3DFX faded away, yet they were still kind of fighting, trying to convince you that they had some new and great technology, but by this time they were pretty much confined to the bargain bucket end of your nearest hardware store. Magazines had ceased to be kind, as we can see from this edition of Maximum PC in December 2000. We weren't expecting much from the Voodoo 4, and we weren't disappointed. Yeah, and over at PC Magazine they just said 3DFX was the architecture to beat, and NVIDIA did just that. Okay, taking a look at price. So this is from an edition of Maximum PC in summer of 2001. So all of the cards have been out maybe just under a year, and all sort of found their place in the market. Everybody by this time would have read many reviews and comparisons to see which ones were the best. We got the Voodoo 5 there for $166. Not sure whether that was worth it or not at the time. Wish I had one now. And then, as I thought, we've got the Voodoo 4 4500 at $95, and we've got sort of the cheapest of the GeForce 2 MXs is $104. So they were fairly squaring off against each other in the same price bracket. So it'll be interesting to see how they compare, see which one of these cheap cards, these entry-level cards, people would break open their piggy banks and see what they can afford. So as I said, this is the pride of my graphics card collection, I think. And the day I got it, I'll never forget the day I got it. I saw this local ad on an app called Gumtree, and I looked at it for about a week, and all you could see was kind of boring stuff in loads of cables and stuff. And then eventually I thought, you know, what the hell? I'll pay £25, even if it's just cables. It's probably worth it. And seriously, there was a metric shit ton of good stuff in those bags. Not only was this Voodoo 4 in there, there were 2 Voodoo 3s, there was some good sound cards, some GeForce 2 MXs and things, loads of useful adapters. It was just probably the best haul I've ever had, I think. No way.
Please enjoy.
Hell yes.
So yeah, days like that don't come along very often. And yeah, for 25 quid. I mean, these things, I don't know what they sell for. Crazy money on eBay, like 400 quid and stuff. This is, I think, possibly the rarest of all 3DFX cards, the PCI Voodoo 4 4500. Yeah, I was very, very happy that day. So yeah, back to the cards. So this particular one is made in Mexico, like so many other awesome things. I never knew quite how many until I started looking. But yeah. Anyway, I digress. Back to the task in hand, and these are the 3 bad boys who are going to be competing against each other. In the center, we've got the Voodoo 4 4500, we've got a Voodoo 3, and we've got one of the original NVIDIA GeForce 2 MXs. This is just the base model, the first one, not an MX 400, of which I have several. I don't think there's much difference. The 400 just got a boost from 175 to 200 on the core clock, I think. To do our testing, we're going to be using a board from Elite Group, the ECSK7S5A Revision 5. So this is a socket A motherboard, and it has bus speeds of 200 and 266. And we're going to be using a single 1 GB stick of RAM on Windows 98. We'll patch it so that that doesn't cause any problems. Also, apologies for the stanky appearance of this board. If I knew I was going to be filming it, I would have given it a bath before I expose you to this crusty thing. I will be giving it a clean after this, I assure you. And for the CPU, we're going to go with Athlon 1300 Thunderbird. I think that might have been the fastest Thunderbird, I can't remember. Anyway, so it's should be a good enough chip for this exercise, probably relatively period correct. This chip has 128 kilobytes of level 1 cache and 256 kilobytes of level 2. Okay, now to get some testing done, I will start with the competition, the GeForce 2 MX. As I said before, the original version, so this one has 175 megahertz clock. I think everything else remained the same, and they just upped it to 200 on the MX 400. So we've got 32 megs of RAM. Of course, the NVIDIA cards have an advantage straight away over the 3DFX in that it has hardware transformer lighting. I believe that these cards ran to about 80% of what you would get out of a GeForce 2 GTS, so you get a lot for your money. It's not surprising they were so successful, and we'll just see how that affects the performance as compared to the two 3DFX cards. Okay, that's the card in, and we'll get some drivers on. Used version 43.45 of the NVIDIA drivers, and of course out of the box they allow you to turn off vertical sync for OpenGL but not for Direct3D, so you have to use the registry hack for that. The easiest way to do this is to get from Guru3D's website the registry file, so you just double click it, and then when you go back into the drivers you can see that all of a sudden you can actually turn off vertical sync in Direct 3D settings. So that's cool. That's them both turned off in OpenGL and Direct 3D. For testing, we're not going to get into anything too in-depth. So I figured, because these cards, apart from the Voodoo 3 of course, but the Voodoo 4 and the GeForce 2 both came out in 2000, using 3D Mark 2000 seemed a good place to start. And then for games, I thought something that would have been current at the time, Unreal Tournament, which is also good because we can test it out in both Direct 3D and Glide on the cards to see if Glide gives the 3DFX cards any kind of advantage. And then finally I thought I'd test with Return to Castle Wolfenstein. So that was a game that came out in 2001. So if you're a budget conscious buyer and you've got a graphics card, there's a good chance you'll still be rocking it in 2001, and see how it holds up with games that would maybe come out about a year and a half after the cards. For these tests, I ran everything in all the games as well at 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, 1280 by 1024 and 1600 by 1200 in both 16-bit and 32-bit colour. So the GeForce 2 MX got what I expect are sort of average to low scores in 3D Mark 2000. At 800 by 600, 16-bit, we got 5148, and then it went 4102, 2947 and 2205 at 1600 by 1200. Then getting into 32-bit, 800 by 600 was 4020, then 2930, then 1899, and then it just wouldn't run at 1600 by 1200 and 32-bit because it didn't have enough video memory. Onto Unreal Tournament at the same resolutions. So 800 by 600 at 16-bit color was giving us 72.3 frames a second, which is pretty okay. 70.6 and then 54.5 at 1280 by 1024. It wouldn't work at 1600 by 1200 and 16-bit, or at least I couldn't get it to work. It was just wasn't scaling correctly to the monitor, though I was using a monitor driver that should have allowed that to work. And then into 32-bit color, it was the same again. It still wouldn't scale at 1600 by 1200, but at 800 by 600 we were getting 69.8 and then 61.6, and 1280 by 1024 still a playable 38.3. So far we've run everything in Direct 3D, but now we're on to Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which is OpenGL. So this kind of covers all the bases, and I'll also run Unreal Tournament in both Glide and Direct 3D on the 3DFX cards. So on this, which would have been the most demanding game, amazingly the GeForce 2 ran successfully at all resolutions. So we didn't get great frame rates, but at 800 by 600 at 16-bit we were getting 40.4, and then it was 36.2, so you're probably pushing it and getting some drops on the minimum frame rate, so that probably wasn't a great experience. And then it was 28.8 and 22.7 in 16-bit. It was kind of only playable at 800 by 600, but when you got to 32-bit, again you were getting 36.2 at 800 by 600. Again, when you hit your minimum frame rates, you'll probably notice it, but then again it dropped away even faster. So 28.7, 20.1, and then at 1600 by 1200 and 32-bit color, which it did run in this time, you got 8.2 frames a second, a slideshow. Okay, so now the main star of the show. This is a card that costs roughly the same as the GeForce 2 we've just checked out. So theoretically, you'd expect it to give competitive performance, though we know already that it doesn't have hardware TNL, so that's not going to be a great start. But it's got 32 megs of RAM, and of course these cards are capable of 32-bit color, which previous 3DFX cards weren't. Of course, that doesn't work in Glide, which is the main reason for buying a Voodoo card. Makes you wonder what 32-bit Glide would have looked like. Anyway, it's a PCI card, as you can see, so I don't know whether the AGP is going to make any difference at all. Probably will do in the case of the GeForce, but we'll see how it gets on. Okay, now for some comparisons. So yeah, it's quite a bit behind. You've got over 5,000 at 800 by 600 on the GeForce versus just over 4,000 on the Voodoo 4, 4,088. And then it slides down in a similar way. 319021771547, so it possibly closes the gap a little bit as you get up to higher resolutions. In 32-bit, it's pretty much the same story. So 800 by 600 on the GeForce was 4020, but it was just under 2000 on the Voodoo 3, and then it went to 2101 and 1249. So it does kind of close the gap a little bit, but I think they're pretty low scores. 1600 by 1200 at 32-bit was the same story with the Voodoo, and it wouldn't run. The results for Unreal Tournament were pretty interesting. At lower resolutions than 16-bit, the Voodoo 4 beats the GeForce by about 10 frames a second in both Glide and Direct 3D. So it's like 80, early 80, 83, 82 versus 72 on the GeForce. And the GeForce sort of gains ground a bit up to 1280 by 1024, where you're getting 54 on the GeForce and 55 on the Voodoo, so more or less neck and neck. Glide was always consistently a little bit slower than Direct 3D. I thought it might have been a bit faster, but it was a different story when you got to 32-bit. Then the Voodoo falls behind the GeForce just by a few frames, but sort of opposite way round, where at lower resolutions at 32-bit they're more or less neck and neck, but the Voodoo falls further behind the higher you get. Neither of the cards would run at 1600 by 1200 and 32-bit. So interesting results in Return to Castle Wolfenstein as well. So the GeForce is behind again, which is surprising to me, but there you go. 800 by 600 at 16-bit, the Voodoo 4's getting 56.1, the GeForce is getting 40.4. It closes the gap a bit when you get up to 1280 by 1024, and the Voodoo's still getting 36, and the GeForce is on 29. The GeForce did run at 1600 by 1200 and 16-bit, only getting 22 frames a second, but the Voodoo wouldn't have it and wouldn't run at all. In 32-bit, the GeForce gets a bit closer, but the Voodoo hangs in there until we get up to 1280 by 1024 at 32-bit. By this time, both cards are in unplayable frame rate territory, below 30 by a good margin, in the 20s and in the teens. The Voodoo wouldn't run at 1600 by 1200, though the GeForce did and was getting sort of a slideshow. So that's surprising. So in both Unreal Tournament and in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, the Voodoo 4 holds its own, and apart from in 32-bit in Unreal Tournament, the GeForce is a bit better, but in Return to Castle Wolfenstein it does pretty well. Okay, next up we got the weakest link. So this poor sucker's only got 60 megs of RAM. We'll go over the specs and compare them properly a bit later after the benchmarks to show exactly how hobbled this card is compared to the Voodoo 4 and the GeForce 2. The only reason why I'm doing this one is there are some places on the net that people have done benchmarks that show this card is faster in certain situations than the Voodoo 4, so I was curious about that. I think Thandor.net has a benchmark where this card is faster, and there's also some on the Vogons wiki which show in certain circumstances this card can also beat the GeForce 4, so that'll be interesting to see. So 3D Mark 2000 for the Voodoo 3, and it's, there you go. So some of the benchmarks like the Thandor one were using 3D Mark 2000, and yeah, the Voodoo 3 is a little bit faster at lower resolutions than the Voodoo 4. Who would have thought? The Voodoo 4 claws its way back and overtakes it just at 1280 by 1024 at 16-bit, and of course wasn't expecting, if the other cards were struggling to run at 1600 by 1200, the Voodoo 3 was never going to really do well with 16 megs, and it wouldn't run at that resolution in 16-bit. But yeah, a couple of benchmarks there where the Voodoo 3 beats the Voodoo 4. So we've got some slightly strange results again in Unreal Tournament. The Voodoo beats the GeForce 2MX in Direct 3D. It was a bit strange. 800 by 600 is slightly ahead by about 4 or 5 frames, and then the GeForce 2 pulls it back pretty quickly to be ahead again, but only just at 1280 by 1024, and the Voodoo 4 is consistently ahead of both of them at that resolutions, at those lower resolutions. Of course we don't do 32-bit. One thing I did notice about the difference between Direct3D and Glide is when you get up to 1600 by 1200, Glide seems to be happier to go to higher resolutions, but Direct3D it wouldn't work. So again, the GeForce 2 doesn't seem to perform very well, or as well as I thought it would. At least I was expecting it to be significantly faster than the Voodoo 3, but at 800 by 600 in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, it's 41 frames a second for the GeForce. The Voodoo 3 gets 43.7, and as said before, the Voodoo 4 is well ahead at that resolution. The Voodoo 3 would only do 1024 by 768, it's 16-bit colour, and there again it was slightly ahead of the GeForce, but it wouldn't run to any higher resolution in Return to Castle Wolfenstein. But even then, once you got up to 1280 by 1024, none of the cards were really playable. The Voodoo 4 was just above 30 frames a second average, which probably means it would have been a dodgy experience, and then it wouldn't do 1600 by 1200. The GeForce did, but it was below playable frame rates. So yeah, that's pretty much it. A few surprises there. The Voodoo 3 at low resolutions seems to outperform my GeForce 2 MX with the drivers that it's got. And in many cases the Voodoo 4 was a better card, but at higher resolutions than 32-bit, the GeForce 2 MX seems to be a bit better. So, a bit of a mixed bag really, some interesting results. Looking at the tech specs for the cards, I would have expected the Voodoo 3 to not really compete at all, but it did at lower resolutions, beat the GeForce 2. Don't know if that could be improved from the GeForce's point of view with some better drivers. Looking at the Voodoo 4 and the GeForce 2, apart from the texture side of things, they're fairly well matched, so I was expecting the GeForce 2 to resoundingly thrash the Voodoo, but it didn't. So yeah, a bit of a fun experiment. The Voodoo 4 is still my prized possession, and yeah, it was nice just to take a closer look at it, because I haven't really, since I got it, I haven't really read much about it or anything like that. So there you go. That's the end of it. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it. And I hope you'll join me for the next one. Thank you very much for watching if you've made it this far.